My phone didn't ring. It pulsed once. A perimeter breach. I swiped the screen, expecting a server outage or a dip in the Asian markets. Instead, I saw ghosts. My parents, Frank and Denise, standing in the lobby of my building 20 years after they threw me out into the rain. They were clutching a damp copy of Forbes with my son's face on the cover. They looked older, desperate, hungry. I didn't panic. I didn't feel a thing. I treated it like a bug in the system. I pressed the intercom button and gave the guard a single instruction. Let them wait. Do not offer them water. Do not offer them a seat. Just let them stand. Then, I opened a digital file on my encrypted drive labeled 1998 Severance. It was time to execute the program I wrote 2 decades ago. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I closed the digital file, but the memory didn't minimize. It expanded, filling the glass office with the scent of rain and expensive leather. I was back there. 20 years ago. Seattle was drowning under a storm that had been raging for a week, but inside my parents' estate, the air was dry and still. I was 16 years old. I was pregnant, and I was standing on a Persian rug that cost more than the total net worth of the boy who had gotten me in trouble. I expected screaming. I expected my mother to throw a vase, or my father to shout about morality and shame. But there was no screaming. That would have been messy. That would have been inefficient. Instead, Frank and Denise sat across from me at the mahogany dining table like we were in a board meeting for a failing subsidiary. They didn't look at me with anger. They looked at me with disappointment. Not the disappointment of a parent, but the disappointment of an investor who realizes they bet on the wrong horse. That was the moment I understood the code they lived by. I call it the narcissist's math. See, to Frank and Denise, I wasn't a daughter. I was an asset. I was a stock in the family portfolio. For 16 years, my value had been projected based on my grades, my appearance, and my potential marriageability into a better real estate dynasty. I was an appreciating asset. But the moment I told them I was pregnant, the math changed. I became a liability. My market value plummeted to 0. Actually, less than 0. I was now a reputational risk. A toxic asset that could infect the rest of their brand. They didn't hate me. Hate implies passion. Hate implies that I still mattered to them emotionally. This was colder than hate. This was a liquidation sale. Frank pushed a yellow legal pad across the polished wood. It wasn't a typed document from a lawyer. It was handwritten in his sharp, jagged script. He called it a severance agreement. He spoke calmly, outlining the terms. I was to leave tonight. I was to never identify myself as a Harrison in public again. I was to never contact their friends, their business partners, or their country club associates. In exchange, they would not sue me for the cost of my upbringing. That was how he phrased it. The cost of my upbringing. As if the food I ate and the roof over my head were loans I had defaulted on. Denise opened her purse. She didn't look me in the eye. She was focused on counting out bills. She placed a small stack of cash on top of the legal pad. $485. It was an odd, specific number. I realized later it was probably just what she happened to have in her wallet at that moment. They weren't giving me seed money for a new life. They were paying a disposal fee. I looked at the money. Then I looked at the legal pad. I picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake. I didn't beg them to let me stay. I knew that any plea for mercy would be a waste of energy. You don't negotiate with a machine that has already decided to delete you. I signed my name at the bottom of the page. I took the $485. I took the legal pad, tearing the sheet off with a sound that ripped through the silence of the room. I walked to the front door. My father didn't get up. My mother went back to arranging flowers in a crystal vase, as if by making the room beautiful, she could erase the ugliness of what she had just done. I stepped out into the rain. The door clicked shut behind me, a heavy, final sound. It was the sound of a server disconnecting. The sound of a file being purged. I walked down the long driveway, the cold water soaking through my thin coat, and I didn't look back. They thought they had thrown away trash. They didn't realize they had just released a prototype into the wild, forcing it to upgrade or die. And I chose to upgrade. The memory dissolved back into the gray static of the Seattle skyline. I was standing at the window, my reflection superimposed over the city I now owned a significant piece of. The rain was still falling, just like it was 20 years ago, but now I was watching it from the 42nd floor, dry and untouchable. Or so I thought. The office door slid open with a soft hydraulic hiss. Joshua walked in. My son. My masterpiece. At 20 years old, he had the restless energy of a nuclear reactor. He was wearing a hoodie that probably cost $300 but looked like it had been fished out of a laundry hamper. That was the aesthetic of the new elite. He was weeks away from ringing the opening bell on Wall Street, launching a clean energy IPO that analysts were calling the next Tesla. He was everything Frank and Denise believed they were, but actually real. Hey, Mom, he said, dropping onto the leather sofa. He was scrolling through his phone, his thumb moving at the speed of light. Quick question. Who is Frank Harrison? The air left the room. It wasn't a gasp, it was a vacuum. I turned slowly. Why do you ask? He messaged me on LinkedIn. Premium account. Sent a connection request, marked urgent. Joshua looked up, his brow furrowed. He says he's my grandfather. Says he's been watching from afar and wants to reconnect before the big day. Is he for real? The firewall had been breached. I had spent 2 decades building a fortress of silence around us. I had encrypted our lives, changed our names, buried the past under layers of shell companies and trusts. But I had underestimated the persistence of a parasite looking for a host. He's a biological relative, I said, my voice flat. Nothing more. Joshua frowned, tapping the screen. It's weird. He's not the only one. You know that guy Shane? The crypto influencer guy on Twitter. Your biological father. I corrected. The one who blocked my number when I told him I was pregnant.
Yeah, him.
He just tagged me in a 60-part thread. He's claiming he co-founded my genius. Says my coding skills are genetic. He's posting pictures of himself from high school side by side with my press headshots. Joshua laughed, but it was a dry, uncomfortable sound. It's trending, Mom. People are eating it up. I walked over and took the phone from his hand. I didn't look at the tweets. I looked at the news alert that had just popped up at the top of his screen. It was a link to the Puget Sound Business Journal. The headline made my vision sharpen into laser focus. The Harrison Legacy, how local real estate moguls seed-funded the city's newest tech unicorn. I tapped the link. There was a photo of Frank and Denise, standing in front of their slightly dilapidated estate, looking noble and weary. The article was a masterclass in fiction. They claimed they had provided the early angel investment for Joshua's education. They claimed they had stepped back to let him find his own path, but were now ready to stand by his side for the IPO. They weren't just claiming emotional connection, they were claiming financial credit. They were rewriting the history of my starvation and turning it into their philanthropy. This wasn't an emotional reunion. This was a coordinated attack. Frank, Denise, Shane, they were circling the wagon. They knew the IPO was happening. They knew the valuation. They weren't here to be grandparents or a father. They were here because their own brands were failing. Frank's real estate empire was crumbling under bad debt. I knew that from the industry whispers. Shane was washed up. They needed a win. They needed Joshua's shine to reflect on them, to boost their credit ratings and social standing. I felt a cold, metallic anger settle in my chest. It wasn't the hot, messy rage of a teenager. It was the cool calculation of a CEO realizing a competitor was trying to steal intellectual property. They were trying to bypass me to get to the asset. They thought I was still the scared girl who signed the paper. They thought they could rewrite the code. Mom, Joshua asked, watching my face. Should I reply? The PR team is asking for a statement. I handed the phone back to him. My hand was steady. No, I said. Do not reply.
Do not block them.
Do not engage. Silence is the only data point we are giving them right now. I walked back to my desk and pressed the intercom. Charles, I said, cancel my afternoon. And meet me in the secure conference room. Bring the unredacted files. They wanted to play the family card. They wanted to leverage the past. Fine. I was going to show them that the past wasn't a marketing strategy. It was a ledger. And the debt was due. Charles didn't knock. He scanned his badge, and the heavy soundproof door clicked open. He walked in, carrying a tablet and a sealed folder. Charles was my first hire, my legal counsel, and the only person besides Joshua who knew where the bodies were buried. He sat down, placing the folder on the glass table with a soft thud. He didn't look worried. He looked annoyed. That was Charles. He viewed emotional drama as an inefficient use of billable hours. "They're still in the lobby," he said, tapping his tablet. "Security says Frank is threatening to call the press if he doesn't get a meeting. He's claiming elder abuse and estrangement caused by undue influence. He wants to paint you as the villain who stole his grandson." Charles looked up, his expression bored. "I have the restraining order drafted. Do you want me to file it, or do you want security to remove them?" I spun my chair around to face the window. The rain was streaking the glass, distorting the city lights into long, bleeding lines of color. "No," I said. "No restraining orders. That's a defensive move. It makes me look scared, and it gives them a story to sell. The heartbroken grandparents fighting a legal battle for love. I don't want to fight them, Charles. I want to audit them." I turned back to the table. "Open the folder I sent you this morning. File code Red Alpha 7. Charles frowned. He tapped his screen. A spreadsheet populated. His eyebrows shot up.
It was a financial dossier.
"Not on my company, but on Harrison Real Estate Holdings, my parents' company." "This is comprehensive," he said. "How did you get their internal ledgers?" "I didn't have to hack them," I said, leaning forward. "They gave them to me." I pulled up a separate window on the main screen. It was a loan application portal for Apex Ventures, the boutique angel investment firm I had founded anonymously 5 years ago to fund underrepresented tech founders. But 6 months ago, we had started receiving applications from a legacy real estate firm in Seattle. A firm that was drowning in debt, over-leveraged on bad commercial properties, and desperate for a lifeline. "Frank and Denise didn't come here today because they saw Joshua on a magazine cover," I said, pointing at the screen. "That was just the trigger. They came here because they are insolvent. They have less than 30 days of liquidity left. They are hemorrhaging cash. They've been pitching Apex Ventures for a bridge loan for 6 months. They think they're talking to an anonymous board of investors. They have no idea they've been sending their balance sheets to the daughter they disowned." Charles scrolled through the applications. He whistled low. "They're begging," he murmured. "These terms, they're offering everything. Their remaining properties, their personal assets." He stopped scrolling. He looked up at me, his eyes narrowing. "Courtney, why haven't you rejected them?" "I did," I said. "I rejected the first 3 applications. Standard form letters. Not a strategic fit. But the 4th one," I swiped to the latest document. It was dated 3 days ago. "The 4th one was interesting. To secure the loan, they needed collateral. Real collateral. And since they don't have any equity left in their properties, they offered something else." I highlighted a paragraph on the screen. Charles read it. His face went hard. It was a clause listing future equity in cleantech IPO as a guaranteed asset. "They listed Joshua's company," Charles said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "They claimed they have a binding verbal agreement for 10% equity in Joshua's startup. They used your son's company as collateral for a loan they can't repay." "Exactly," I said. The anger was gone now. It was replaced by the hum of a weapon fully charged. "That is wire fraud, Charles. They lied on a federal loan application submitted to my bank. They didn't just break my heart 20 years ago. Today they broke the law." I stood up and walked to the door. "Don't send them away.
Go down to the lobby.
Tell them the angel investor from Apex Ventures is ready to see them. Tell them the board has reviewed their application and we are ready to close the deal." Charles stood up, a slow, shark-like smile spreading across his face. "You want a meeting?" "No," I said. "I want a closing. Bring them up. Let's finish this transaction." The boardroom on the 42nd floor is what I call the killing jar. It's a glass box suspended against the gray Seattle sky, soundproof, temperature-controlled, and designed to make anyone sitting on the other side of the table feel small. I watched them on the monitor for 5 minutes before I went in. Frank was pacing, checking his watch, wiping sweat from his upper lip. Denise was reapplying lipstick, her hand shaking so bad she smeared it on her cheek. Shane was slumped in a chair, scrolling through his phone, probably looking for a new crypto scam to pivot to. They were waiting for the managing partner of Apex Ventures. They were waiting for a savior. I smoothed the front of my blazer. I didn't check my reflection.
I didn't need to.
I pushed the heavy glass door open. The air in the room changed instantly. Frank spun around, his face arranging itself into a practiced business smile that died halfway up his cheeks. Denise dropped her lipstick. Shane looked up, bored, until his eyes locked on mine. "Good afternoon," I said. I didn't smile. I walked to the head of the table and sat down. Charles sat to my right, opening his laptop with a sharp click. For 10 seconds, nobody breathed. The silence was heavy, pressurized. It was the sound of a reality distortion field collapsing. "Courtney?" Frank whispered. His voice cracked. He looked at me, then at the empty chair at the head of the table, then back at me. The math was hitting him. You work here?" "I own here," I said. "I am Apex Ventures. I am the board. I am the angel investor you've been emailing 3 times a day for the last 6 months." Denise let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. She surged out of her chair, arms reaching out. "Oh my God.
Courtney, look at you."
We didn't know. "We've missed you so much. We were just talking about you, weren't we, Frank? We were just saying how much we wanted to fix things." It was a masterful pivot. In less than 3 seconds, she had switched from desperate applicant to grieving mother. It was a performance that might have worked on the 16-year-old girl shivering in the rain. But that girl wasn't in the room. "Sit down, Denise," I said. My voice wasn't loud. It was flat. It was the voice of a judge reading a sentencing guideline. She froze. She looked at Frank. He nodded slowly, sinking into his chair. He looked smaller than I remembered. The giant who had dominated my childhood was just an old man in an ill-fitting suit, terrified of being audited. "This isn't a family reunion," I said. "This is a due diligence meeting regarding loan application number 4097. "Courtney, please," Frank started, leaning forward, trying to summon his old authority. Let's not mix business with family. We can put the past behind us. I'm proud of you. Look at this place. You've done well. And Joshua, my God, he's a genius. We just want to help him. We want to be part of his life." "Help him," I repeated. I opened the folder in front of me. I pulled out 2 documents. The first was a yellowed, crinkled piece of legal pad paper. The ink was faded, but the jagged handwriting was unmistakable. I slid it across the glass table. It stopped right in front of Frank. "That is the severance agreement you made me sign 20 years ago," I said. "You bought my silence for $485. You relinquished all rights to my future, my earnings, and my offspring. You declared me a bad asset." Frank stared at the paper. His face went gray. I pulled out the second document. It was crisp, white, and stapled. "And this," I said, sliding it next to the yellow page, "is the loan application you submitted to my firm 3 days ago." I pointed to the collateral section. "Charles, would you read the highlighted clause?" Charles didn't look up from his screen. "Borrower guarantees repayment via 10% equity stake in cleantech IPO, pending verbal agreement with CEO Joshua Harrison." Shane sat up straight. "We were going to ask him," he blurted out. "He's my kid. He'd give me the shares." "It's not a lie." "It is a lie," I said. "And because you submitted this application across state lines to a federally insured financial institution, it's not just a lie. It's wire fraud. It's bank fraud. It is a federal felony carrying a prison sentence of up to 30 years. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the rain hitting the glass 42 stories up. Frank looked at the documents. Then he looked at me. And then he started to cry. It wasn't a dignified cry. It was a messy, ugly, terrified sobbing. He put his head in his hands. "We're going to lose the house," he choked out. "Courtney, please. We have nothing. The creditors are calling every day. We're drowning. You're our daughter. You can't send your own father to prison. You can't let us starve." I watched him crumble. I watched Denise reach for his hand, weeping about how they were sorry, how they didn't mean it, how family comes first. And in that moment, I waited for the feeling. I waited for the vindication. I waited for the rush of victory. I waited for the anger that had fueled me for 20 years to explode. I expected to feel like avenging angels standing over the ruins of my enemies. But I didn't feel any of that. I felt static. I looked at these two people sobbing in my boardroom, and I realized I didn't hate them. I didn't love them. I didn't pity them. They were just strangers. They were bad data. They were a corrupted file that I had finally managed to quarantine. This is what nobody tells you about the opposite of love. It isn't hate. Hate is intimate. Hate requires energy. The opposite of love is indifference. It is the peace of a quiet room after the noise stops. It is looking at the monsters under your bed and realizing they are just piles of old laundry. I looked at Charles. He gave me a small nod. "I'm not sending you to prison," I said. Frank looked up, hope flaring in his wet eyes. "Thank you. Oh God. Thank you, honey. I knew you." "I'm not sending you to prison." I cut him off, because I don't want my son's IPO launch tainted by the headline CEO's grandfather arrested for fraud. That is a business decision, not a mercy. I stood up. The movement made them flinch. "But we're going to settle this debt. Today." I turned to the window, watching the rain. "You have two choices. Choice A, I hand this file to the FBI, and you spend your retirement in a federal cell. Choice B, you sign a full liquidation agreement." "Liquidation?" Denise whispered. "Everything," I said, turning back to face them. "The house, the cars, the remaining commercial properties. You sign it all over to the foundation I'm launching tomorrow. The proceeds will go to housing homeless teenagers who were kicked out by parents like you." "But where will we live?" Frank stammered. "That house, it's all we have left." "You have $485, I said. "I suggest you make it last." Charles slid the liquidation documents across the glass surface. They moved with a smooth, terrifying hiss. Frank didn't read them. He didn't call his lawyer. He knew that any lawyer he called would tell him that wire fraud was a non-negotiable destination. He picked up the pen. His hand was shaking so violently that the tip tapped against the paper like a Morse code distress signal.
He signed.
He signed away the lake house. He signed away the commercial strip malls in Bellevue that were already underwater. He signed away the cars, the art collection, and the remaining stock in his failing company. He transferred the entirety of the Harrison legacy to the Apex Youth Foundation, an entity I had established 10 minutes ago to convert their vanity into shelter for kids they would have spit on. Denise watched him sign. She wasn't crying anymore. She was in shock. She was watching her social standing evaporate in real time. When Frank finished, he pushed the papers back. He looked like a man who had just been hollowed out. "It's done," he whispered. "Not quite," I said. I turned my attention to Shane. Shane was trying to make himself invisible in the high-back leather chair. He didn't have assets to seize. He thought he was immune because he was already bankrupt. "I don't have anything you want," Shane said, his voice thin. "I'm broke. You know that." "I don't want your money, Shane," I said. "I want your silence." Charles opened a second folder. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and a USB drive. He placed them in front of Shane. "That drive contains the unsealed records of your possession charges from '99, I said. "The ones your father paid a judge to bury, so you could play quarterback. It also contains the DM logs from your crypto Discord where you admitted to rug pulling your followers last year." Shane's face drained of color. He looked at the USB drive like it was a live grenade. "If you ever mention Joshua's name again," I said, my voice dropping, "if you ever tag him, tweet about him, or whisper that you share his DNA, I will upload this drive to every tech blog and federal agency in the country. You won't just be a failed influencer. You'll be an inmate." Shane snatched the paper and signed it. He didn't even read the header. He signed his life away to protect the lie of his own reputation. I stood up. The meeting was adjourned. I pressed the button on the console. Security, I said. Escort the guests to the loading dock exit. The loading dock. Denise gasped. Courtney, please. The lobby, people will see. Exactly, I said. You don't have a parking validation. And you don't have a car. We took those in the liquidation. You're walking. 2 security officers entered. They were large, silent, and professional. They didn't touch my parents. They just stood there, radiating the kind of authority that makes entitled people shrink. Frank stood up. He looked at me one last time. I think he was waiting for a hug, or a goodbye, or some acknowledgement that we had once shared a home. I looked at him and checked my watch. You have 10 minutes to clear the perimeter, I said, before I file the trespassing charges. They walked out. Frank, Denise, Shane, the holy trinity of my trauma, marching out in a single file line, flanked by guards. The heavy glass doors hissed shut behind them. I walked to the window. I looked down. 42 stories below, the streetlights were just coming on. The rain was coming down harder now, a sheet of gray water washing the city clean. I waited. Minutes later, 3 small figures emerged from the side of the building. They stood on the sidewalk. They looked up at the sky, then at each other. They had no umbrellas. They had no ride. They had no plan. I watched the rain soak into Frank's suit. I watched Denise try to cover her hair with a purse that was no longer hers. I watched them shiver. It was a perfect mirror. The symmetry was mathematical. 20 years ago, they had watched me walk into the storm from their warm, dry window. Now, the polarity had reversed. I was the one behind the glass. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel sadness. I felt the satisfaction of a balanced equation. The error had been corrected. The system was stable. I turned away from the window. Charles, I said, format the drive. And order dinner. Joshua has a bell to ring tomorrow. The next morning, the bell rang. Not a phone. Not an alarm. The actual opening bell of the NASDAQ. The sound was crisp, metallic, and loud enough to shake the floorboards of the trading floor. Joshua stood on the podium, grinning, his hand frozen in the air after pressing the button. Confetti rained down, white and biodegradable, naturally. The monitors behind him flashed his company's ticker symbol in bright green. I watched from the wings. I wasn't on the podium. I didn't need to be. I was wearing a simple cream suit, holding a coffee cup that was warmer than my mother's hands had ever been. Charles stood next to me, checking the opening share price on his tablet. We're up 40% in the first 3 minutes, he murmured. The valuation just crossed the unicorn threshold. You're officially a billionaire, Courtney. Joshua is, I corrected. You funded him, Charles said. You built the infrastructure. You wrote the code that kept him safe. I looked at my son. He was shaking hands with bankers and analysts, looking completely in his element. He didn't look like a kid who had learned to read in a public library because we didn't have a living room. He looked like the future. I thought about the lighthouse principle. For years, I had told myself I was building a fortress. I thought my success was a wall designed to keep people like Frank and Denise out. I thought I was digging a moat to protect us from the poverty and the shame they had tried to drown me in. But standing there, watching the ticker tape scroll, I realized I had it wrong. I hadn't built a fortress. I had built a lighthouse. A fortress is defensive. It's about fear. It's about hiding. A lighthouse is different. A lighthouse stands in the middle of the storm, taking the beating of the waves so that it can project a light for others. I hadn't just survived the wreckage of my family. I had turned the wreckage into a foundation. I stood firm so that Joshua wouldn't crash on the rocks. I wasn't hiding anymore. I walked out onto the floor. Joshua saw me. He broke away from a reporter and ran over, enveloping me in a hug that knocked the wind out of me. We did it, he whispered. Mom, we actually did it. You did it, I said, smoothing his hair. No. He pulled back, looking me in the eye.
We.
I saw the news, Mom. The Apex Youth Foundation. You launched it this morning. I smiled. I needed somewhere to put the proceeds from the liquidation. It's going to change everything, he said. For kids like you were. That's the plan, I said. I looked up at the big screen. The stock was still climbing. Somewhere in Seattle, in a cheap motel or a guest room, Frank and Denise were probably watching this on a borrowed television. They were seeing the wealth they had tried to steal, the legacy they had tried to buy. They were seeing the light, but they were stranded in the dark water, miles from shore. And for the first time, I didn't care if they were watching. The lighthouse doesn't care about the ship that chooses to sink. It just shines. If this story reminded you that your worth is not defined by who walked away, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to know that family is a title you earn, not a gene you inherit. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to fire a family member from your life?